All right. Dr. Chris Ferguson, thank you so much for making the time to have this conversation. I came across your work after my mentor, Scott Miller, read my new book, Kids These Days. He started just sending me all random things about moral panics.
Okay.
And I saw an interview with you talk, and the host was also talking about pinball bans, which just
Hmm.
cracked me up. And that sent me on a deep dive of actually how hard it was to reverse pinball bans. And
Hmm.
speaking of how people talk about kids, I found headlines in the 50s and 60s of like probation officers saying every kid that comes through the youth court is just playing pinball.
Yeah, that's probably true.
Yeah, that's right. It's very fun. I grew up with a pinball machine in our basement, so that's probably why I was a delinquent. And um, so can you tell me what is a moral panic and what got you
Yeah.
interested in this?
Yeah, I mean, basically, right? If everybody's doing a thing, then it turns out that everyone that comes through jail or prison is doing that thing, so they're not lying. Right. Yeah, I mean, so a moral panic is typically, kind of a belief that springs up in a society that tries to explain some kind of perceived social problem onto some kind of like external moral cause that people already don't like for one reason or another. So something seems to be going wrong. Now it might really be going wrong, or maybe it isn't. And people are blaming a thing, and it's not necessarily really trying to fix the problem, but really make the audience, if you will, the public feel good about themselves. That's kind of the moral element, right? It's like feel good about themselves because they're protecting kids or they're protecting women or they're protecting whatever group that they might be minorities, that they think that they're, protecting. And it is a typically very anti-science, very moralistic, very sensationalist type of view. A lot of them focus in on kids, but not all of them do. A lot of them focus in on media and technology, but not necessarily. There are some short ones, like the kind of like scary clowns. Some people thought for a couple of years ago there were scary clowns, stalking schools all the time, or the Momo challenge, the idea that kids are going online and doing this challenge that eventually leads to suicide or something like that. So sometimes there's some short ones, and then there are these big ones, right? There was like a Satan panic back in the early
Mhm.
90s. Some people I think pretty reasonably believe that there was kind of like the 2020 race panic, around like the idea that the U.S. was systemically racist. Video games, radio, social media right now. I recently read an article that in the early 1800s, apparently kaleidoscopes of all
Yeah, I
things.
sent you
Were,
that. Yeah.
oh, that was you that sent me that one. All right, yeah. See, I apologize. I couldn't
Yeah.
remember where I got it from. Yeah, so
Yeah.
there's all these like crazy, ideas that the kids today, as your book title says, there's something wrong with the kids these days, and it turns out to be this thing that we didn't like anyway, particularly as older adults. And lo and behold, if only we get rid of this thing we already didn't like, then the idea is that this would fix the problem.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's kind of what they are, basically.
And so, like, you threw a good segue to our book. One of the things when we started writing Kids These Days, I wrote this with my colleague Nevin Harper in Canada. And when we started, he just started a folder called Kids These Days. And we didn't think that'd be a title, but
Yeah,
I just started diving into how long has this saying been around for?
right.
Which you can trace back to, Socrates was said to whinge about kids and say they're disrespectful and they don't know how to think and they're lazy. And it goes
Hmm.
on and on and on. And then one of the things that caught me off guard is I went, but our professions of whether it's social work or psychology, now we play along with like really pathologizing them. Like,
Hmm.
you know, and so I wanted to talk about the anxious generation a little bit, not to harp on this forever, but even the title alone was really like, well, there's pills for that,
Yeah.
like keep your phones more
Yeah.
Xanax.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, the irony, right, is that if you look at like all the generations on record, I mean, if you're thinking of like Gen Z, which I guess is the
Yeah.
generation we're supposed to be, now we're on to Gen Alpha, whatever. I don't
Yeah.
know. I don't even like the way we
No.
name generations. What, yeah, but they're in most cases they're one of the best generations on record, right? They commit fewer violent crimes, they smoke less, they drink less, they use less drugs, they're record low teen pregnancy, they stay in
Mhm.
school more. All these kind of like they volunteer in their communities more. All these kind of like wonderful things about them, and nobody says, what? Thank God that like social media and smartphones came along, because obviously all these wonderful things happen in the smartphone and social media age with Gen Z. So, that's awesome. Look at the causal relationship, right?
Mhm.
Smartphone, social media, crime dropped, smoking dropped, all this kinds of other stuff. But what people focus in on is the one thing that went in the negative direction. That was like the suicide and mental health, sort of issue. Um, but if you look at even that, the generation that was the worst was my generation, right? It was Gen X, all these like names, letters for names. And so, even today, I mean, if you're worried about suicide, a basically a man my age has about 3 to 5 times the likelihood of killing themselves as a teenage girl.
Mhm.
And we're all worried about the teenage girls, and that's great. We should worry about teenage girls,
Yeah.
but I think that created this very myopic, idea of what was happening in society as people were worried about in the United States. Teen suicide was increasing. It's now going down, by the way,
Mhm.
but it was increasing, for a while, and that is worrisome. But their parents' generation, that suicide rate was flying through the roof. And that's really the anxious generation, right? Is
Yeah.
the parents much more so than the teenagers. And for some reason, people were just stubbornly refused to put those things together and say, well, maybe if teens are in the United States are experiencing more mental health problems, maybe that's because their parents are clearly experiencing these huge problems, the opioid epidemic, the middle-aged suicide rate was shooting up. And people just refuse to put those two things together and think that maybe they actually, because they correlate almost perfectly, right?
Yeah.
That maybe there was a connection there, but people prefer to blame the phones. So, oh well.
Yeah, that's right. So in the interview I saw that put me onto your work, you were you were asked to read The Anxious Generation before it was
Yeah.
published,
hmm
and you raised some concerns about that. What were some of those concerns?
Well, it was rubbish. It was
Yeah.
basically what's the concern. Yeah, they had me read a few chapters. I remember, well, one or two chapters or something like that. It wasn't the whole book, I don't think. But yeah, so if you actually buy The Anxious Generation, which you shouldn't, by the way,
Yeah.
because it's just garbage. If you look at the acknowledgments in the back, wherever the hell it is, you'll see my name. My name is in this book
You
forever.
got in.
Thanks me. He thanked me for, well, which is actually very, very nice that he did that.
Yeah, sure.
But he didn't listen to me whatsoever. And I told him like, this was back before he had really, I mean, he had been complaining, I guess, about social media since he had written the coddling of the American mind. So it wasn't necessarily a new topic for him,
Yeah, sure.
um, but he also had done, kind of like good work in the areas of like, free speech on college campuses and that kind of stuff. So I
Oh,
think that got him some cred. It also, I think, has resulted in some fanboying, particularly in that kind of like anti-woke crowd a little bit, that they now can't see that he might have gotten something horribly wrong. But, so there might have been some negative results from that. But I tried to tell him like, you got this like platform, like there are so many other things that are like, that are like make sense that you could actually use that with, and the things that he was trying to claim in the book were just simply not true. But he didn't, obviously he didn't listen. So I don't
yeah.
know what the point of me reading the chapter or chapters or whatever it was that he had me read, because he obviously didn't, in any substantive way, listen to my feedback.
And what would you say, besides that, the statistics are all kind of bizarre and kind of presented in a misleading way, what sort of things stood out to you with what you read? What was your main concern?
I mean, it's fear mongering, yeah, anti-science fear mongering, right? I mean, there really were his portrayal of the research evidence was, I thought, my opinion was misleading, that he wasn't portraying a. I used to complain about this with some of the video game scholars as well. Like when they would do their literature reviews and science articles, they would talk about a field that just didn't exist. Like, that all the evidence is basically on my side, it turns out, by happy coming. It was never true for video games. It wasn't true, with social media. His claim that there's this kind of evidence base that supports him is just not factually true.
Yeah.
The graph lines, the trend lines that he had portrayed were cherry picked, I think, and in some cases relied on some data that were dubious. And maybe we know more now today, in fairness, than when he was putting them together. That we know now that those, self-report data in particular is notoriously unreliable.
Yeah.
And I think it was missing lots of other trend lines that could have been included, that if he had done that would have made the picture a lot more complicated and a lot less clear. It just felt like it was cherry picked. It was, um, not representing where the actual science was. And at the same point was in some cases advocating for policies that were at best a waste of time, and in some cases may actually have been harmful in different ways, at very least in the sense of distracting people from real things that are influencing kids' wellness today, which is mostly families, as we talked about,
Yeah.
and schools, primarily. And then in some cases, really advocated for policies that are anti-free speech, which I was surprised by, given that he kind of rose to fame, at least in my orbit,
Yeah,
as on
totally.
this kind of like free speech, platform. And now he's really advocating on behalf of government regulation of, different sorts of media and technology that, he didn't like, and granted, there's this element of like, well, it's for the kids, it's for the children, this is for like under 16s and, that kind of stuff. But that's still a free speech issue, and that's why a lot of these policies that he advocated for, particularly in the social media bans in the United States, are failing in the courts, because this is still a legitimate free speech issue.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, I work at a university in Australia. I'm from Washington, D.C., so I really liked his message with previous books because I was in a political city where no one could talk to each other, you
Right.
know?
Yeah, and
And
that was a real problem.
it's a real
Yeah.
problem. And so when the book came out, and then I mean it came out April last year, by November, the Australian federal government had, by next year, this is
Yeah.
legislation. We will ban social media for everybody under 16. That rolls out a month from now, so I'm getting asked about it all the time. And I keep saying, like, I'm no expert on harms or bonuses of social media. But I will tell you that in 2020, we were one of the most locked down countries in the world, and we told all children, go to school online, be online, you're digital natives. Your whole life's going to be online. You need digital literacy. And only 2 years removed from these serious lockdowns, we're saying, get the hell offline. You cannot be online. The online's bad for you. And meanwhile, human rights organizations like Amnesty International, they're all saying this is not a good idea. Kids need
Yeah.
freedom of information, freedom to share information, freedom to communicate. And so, do you think it is just the moral angle that gets adults to kind of not really think this through all the time?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, you can see the same kind of language as in previous moral panics. I mean, and a classic one, of course, is, which I see all the time, and probably, maybe more frequently now, and maybe that is because we live in a much more online world than 20 years ago
Yeah.
when I first started doing, video game stuff. But I very frequently will people say, "Oh, well, social media is bad. Smartphones are bad. Whatever." I say, "Well," and they'll have like a specific idea, like, maybe it does this, it does this X thing. I'll say, "Well, you know what? I've actually got a research article that I know about that somebody did that addresses that exactly." So people say, like, well, smartphones mean that kids aren't spending time with friends as much. And I say, well, actually, that's a great question. Glad you brought that up. I know exactly of a study that actually addresses this and finds out that in fact that kids that use smartphones have exactly as many friends and spend as much time with them as kids that don't, or maybe even are better. In some cases, it turns out it's actually easier to coordinate if you have a
Mm.
smartphone. There's a couple, and I'll share these studies with you, and people say, I don't care what the research says. I just
Right.
know it, and I know it in my bones, or it's like the Dothraki in Game of Thrones, like it is known, but I've heard this quote over and over again, like literally, like verbatim. That it's like I don't care what the science says, over and over and over again, recently, and that's fascinating, right? I mean, that like you're just coming out and admitting at this point with that language that you're indulging a moral panic essentially. And it's been very frequent. I mean, it's not just one or two or three times that I've heard this, but really quite a lot.
It's fascinating to me. We interviewed a series of different people when we wrote Kids These Days, and one of them um, was Dr. Mari Swingle. She's a neurotherapist up in Canada, and she wrote about the phones and the brain and this stuff over 10 years ago. And she said we need to work on digital integration and not as much digital interference. This was her whole argument. And we said, that sounds like we're pretty level-headed, and that sounds great. And it was really interesting to see her work not cited at all in anything.
Off
And
message.
you know, and but then Nevin, my co-author, interviewed an environmental toxins researcher,
Yeah.
and he was fascinating. And I said to Nevin, I said, I don't know how we can include this in the book because the only thing it'll do is mean no one will ever go out to a restaurant again, and everyone's going to be scared shitless of everything.
Yeah.
But when the hype of the phones kept coming, and I said, we'll bury this toxins chapter at the end of this book when no one gets to it, right? But it started creeping up because I started seeing this. We need to ban this. We need government and regulation. We need all this. And I'm sitting there going, they can't ban things that actually poison you. Like,
Hmm. Hmm.
like this felt
Yeah.
like such a symbolic gesture where I'm going, we all still have like lead in us and stuff. Like,
Right. Arsenic.
there's
Like
some,
that's right.
yeah, like lead is still sometimes allowed in the production of children's toys to help the
Interesting.
plastic
I did
bounce
not know.
to
Okay.
help
Yeah.
plastic bounce back. And I'm going, and we're talking about phones. Like,
Yeah.
like, but
Yeah.
it was just such an interesting thing how this just took off and ran with it. And then it's just, I don't think anyone has thought through what next,
Yeah.
you know?
Well, there was this kind of like performative helplessness, I think, with a lot. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. And in one sense, I mean, there were all these other bigger issues that we're ignoring, or people say like, I was joking. I remember reading somewhere like people was like, well, what's the safest level of arsenic in water, or whatever. It's like, oh, that
Yeah.
seems like, I don't know. I didn't
Yeah.
know there was one.
Yeah.
Okay, that seems like something I ought to be like nervous about, whatever.
Yeah.
But people will kind of do this like with tech, they're all this like performative stuff, like the algorithms or notifications. Oh my God, I get so many notifications. What do I do? We need the government to step in because of notifications. Like first off, you can turn those off
Yeah.
anytime you want, and you turn them on in the first place because when you downloaded that app, it asked you, do you want notifications? And you said
Mhm.
yes.
Yeah.
Literally two, three button pushes, and you could turn those suckers off. The same thing with algorithms. I mean, people always like the algorithms is pushing all this evil stuff. Like you can tell it when you see a video that you don't like the video or like not watch the video, and it will, learn. So like with my experience, I actually like spend a little bit of time cultivating my online experience, and so like on Facebook, which is basically the obituary page of social media anyway, right?
Yeah.
There's no kids there.
No.
I'm only half joking. I literally go, "Who's dead now from my high school,
Yeah.
whatever." I mean, I see, because it does this like AI stuff, right? Which maybe some people don't like, and that's fair enough. But it's always like shooting AI stuff, like every third thing you see or whatever. But
Yeah.
what it shows me is Dungeons and Dragons stuff, World War II tanks and like old houses in New England, that kind of stuff, which is stuff that I like.
Mm.
So I actually don't mind. I mean, I like seeing they'll show me like an airplane from World War II I never heard of before. It's like, oh, that's actually kind of interesting, or whatever. And that's because like I've actually clicked, sometimes saying like, no, I don't want to see more of this thing, or
Hmm.
or I'll mute that people sometimes, right? That are I don't like politics on my Facebook, so I'll like mute
Yeah.
people that are talking about Trump or Bush or Biden, whatever the hell.
Yeah.
But I used to get them all the time to be like therapy stuff, like, have you thought about being in therapy, whatever. I used to all the time get these advertisements, and because I'm in psychology, right?
Yeah.
They assume that maybe I need therapy, which might be true.
Yeah.
But I eventually just started clicking, like, no, I don't. This ad's just not that interesting, and now I don't see them anymore, right? I mean, these
Mhm.
these are actually like even if notifications and algorithms are a problem, they're a fixable problem, like literally very actually easy for us as individuals to fix our experience here.
Mm.
And it seems like if we're going to worry about kids, like that's useful information, right? Like you're talking about digital literacy, right? Or digital
Yeah.
integration, right? You know, like maybe kids don't know this if they're 13, right? You know what I mean? But I know it because someone said, "Oh, did you know like in on Twitter you can change the tab from the for you to
Mm.
follow, or whatever, and it's a very different experience." It's like, "Oh yeah, it turns out it is."
Mm.
So I mean, I think we probably should be spending time, with kids in whether it's in schools, whether it's as parents, whether there's some other sort of, I don't know, however we decide to do it, saying like, here's how you turn off notifications if you don't want them. Here's how you can teach the algorithm what you want. The algorithm doesn't want us to watch, ISIS beheadings. The
Yeah.
algorithm shows us ISIS beheadings because you keep watching ISIS beheadings.
Yeah.
It literally knows what you're watching. It doesn't have a motive to show us. If everybody wanted to watch cat videos, it would show us cat videos. It has no particular desire to show us
Mhm.
anything in particular. The big wigs in social media didn't all sit around and said more ISIS beheadings are good.
Yeah. Right.
It just wants us to spend more time on it, which is fair enough. It's a company. It's what it's supposed to do. So just stop watching the ISIS beheadings, and you'll get fewer ISIS beheadings.
Mm.
Go watch actual cat videos. You have the control over this stuff. But so I think that's what we need to start telling like kids. And maybe kids already know this better than the older adults do. I don't know, but that is healthier for kids than saying you can't use this thing until you hit 16, and then we're just going to throw you onto it and good luck to you. That's a much less useful approach than some kind of media literacy.
And it feels like a shoot the messenger sort of like approach, which is, here's this awful thing, and
Yeah.
instead of controlling this, we're just going to police you.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there definitely are aspects of social media companies or whatever. Nobody thinks they're angels. I mean,
No.
you don't have to believe this. You don't. But on the other hand, you don't have to believe that the news media or the anxious generation or whatever are angels either, because they're selling you fear. That they're a capitalist enterprise that is trying to profit off of your anxieties. That's why the anxious generation really is the generation of readers who are dumb enough to buy this book and that scares the shit out of themselves over something that they really shouldn't have to worry about,
Yeah.
which we're all going to realize like in 25
Oh,
years or maybe less.
totally.
It's sort of like nobody buys The Seduction of the Innocent by Frederick Wertham anymore. That was basically the exact same book, just about comic books in the 1950s. Literally the same, like delinquency, mental health. He was afraid comic books were turning, kids gay because apparently Batman and Robin were secretly gay or something of that sort. And then, we have Jonathan Haidt getting on PBS and telling people that social media is making girls trans. So it's literally the same trajectory in many respects
Yeah.
that we saw with Frederick Wertham, 60, 70 years ago. But, now we look back at Frederick Wertham, we think he's an idiot, and nobody buys the book anymore or thinks it's science.
Yeah.
So at some point in the future, we're going to realize this about, what we're going through now too.
Oh, yeah. I think, and with how fast things change, and my son said to me yesterday, "What do you think the next one will be?" And I said, "It's already here. It's AI. You
Mhm.
know, it's already, we're
Yeah,
watching it now. It's coming,
yeah.
you
I
know?"
like how that one has shifted though. I mean, have you noticed? And you see these shifts sometimes too. So it's very similar, like with how, like literally the same social psychology, like gene twins, right? For a while
Yeah.
there was a narcissism epidemic. The narcissism epidemic, like social media is making people more narcissistic. And then when the numbers moved in the opposite direction, conveniently it shifted to like, it's making people mentally ill and suicidal and blah blah blah
Yeah.
blah blah. And like everybody's forgotten about the narcissism epidemic. Like, shouldn't that be like, I don't know. I mean, shouldn't there be somebody be watching like the just how the narrative shifts? But with AI, right? Everybody was afraid of like a Skynet for a while there, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
GPT is going to take over the world.
Yeah.
And then, we realized Chat GPT can't write an accurate essay, let
Right.
alone
Yeah.
take over the world, right? So yeah, so there was this kind of like moving goalposts or even just completely different goalposts in some ways that like, Skynet, then people kind of realize like that's never going to happen probably. Then now it's shifting into like, does it make our kids dumb or, is it gonna, is it gonna like displace some jobs, which actually is probably the most reasonable of the
Yeah,
fears
totally. Yeah.
about AI, but but probably it's not going to ruin the world. I'm waiting for the Wall-E generation. I remember like watching Wall-E the movie, and there's
Mhm.
all these like humans like hanging out in a spaceship that have like they can just do whatever the hell they want, eat what they want, they have to play, and this AI takes care of them, right? And
Yeah.
that's bad. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like somehow
Yeah.
we know it's bad because they're all fat, right? You know what I
Yeah.
mean? That's sort of like, I guess, a bit of a fat phobia kind of a thing. But we
Yeah.
know that this, So and then this like little Wally comes along and like ruins this. I mean,
Yeah.
it's like,
Yeah.
wait a minute, that
Yeah.
doesn't. I'm all kind of okay with living on a cruise ship forever, like
Right.
in the universe, but I don't know. But yeah, absolutely, AI is the we're already in it. So
Yeah.
and there is a subtle shift, right? It seems like people I mean, obviously you're living this Australian social media ban, so obviously social media is still there, but I'm feeling a little less energy around social media. It's now like in the United States, it's all these like cell phone bans in schools
Yeah.
or like thing, and I think that's a bit of a shifting goalpost again. Like legally, the social media bans were not working in the U.S. because they all were getting struck down. There's still stuff going on there, but it wasn't being successful. The research was coming out and wasn't really showing that social media was causing mental health issues. And now I think there's a shift to like cell phone bans, and I think there's like an element of like, well, nobody really wants kids on their cell phones in the middle of a class. I mean, I think there's a
Well,
fair enough point,
yeah.
but the question is this really going to actually help kids? And I think that's a more dubious question. And people are making these really big claims about it. Um, and yeah, and now it seems to already be shifting to this like AI and AI chatbots and all these kinds of things. And so it's really this like whack-a-mole, sort of element of like moral panic. Like you kind of start like calming people down about the social media, but then what about cell phones in schools?
Yeah.
And if they start, well, okay, it turns out these cell phone bans actually aren't doing much good.
Yeah.
We already are starting to kind of get that data. And then people are like, well, oh, AI chatbots, they're like engaging in romantic affairs with
Yeah.
13-year-olds, which I mean, fair enough, is pretty creepy, but
Yeah, no, that well, it is pretty creepy.
yeah.
But and your AI therapist that's coming as well.
That doesn't
No,
bother me at all. Actually, I think that's going to work out.
well, you want to see something funny? I show this to everyone. Let me reach up and grab this. I
Uh,
found my wife's father figure was an academic, and he
yeah.
died last year. And I went to his wife was like, come steal all his books. So I went to
Nice.
his bookshelf and I found this is the first publication of Psychology Today, right? It's
Oh, wow. Okay.
printed on A3, 1973. And I show everybody this. This is so wild. It's a really cool read about the state of psychology in the 60s, you know?
Yeah.
This section is about artificial intelligence.
Interesting.
And
Okay.
if you look here, interviews with a therapeutic computer,
Oh, wow.
1968.
Nice.
And so
Interesting. Yeah.
it's funny that like we've done all this before.
You done it. Yeah.
It's all
Yeah.
been done. It all just goes in circles, you
Well,
know?
I remember, so this is going to be a little bit, of a deep dive
Yeah.
into, my musical taste, but Kate Bush, who just got in the news again recently because of Stranger Things, right? Running up that
Mhm.
hill has been on Stranger Things. But she had an album in 1989 called The Sensual World, and one of the songs was A Deeper Understanding.
Mhm.
So this is the deep dive. Most people have never heard of the song. It's a great
Mhm.
song, though. Look it up.
I
Listen
will.
to it. But essentially the song is about this dude who like, buys a computer program to talk to him. And then of course he becomes addicted to it. That's the whole premise of the song. It even
Yeah.
has like little dial-up tones,
Oh yeah.
in part of the song because it was 1989. So it is interesting. That's what I mean. I can't do math fast enough in my head, like 35 years ago or something like that. I
Mhm.
don't know. But here's Kate Bush, doing this actually very cool, interesting song
Yeah.
about like dial up, like pre AOL era, like,
Yeah.
computer program, this idea that like it's a chatbot, basically it's a chatbot, and like this dude is gonna like ruin his life, because he becomes so addicted to chatting with his chatbot sort of thing. So yeah, even the AI fears have been around, a
Mm.
long time in one sense or another, and but But I think, I mean, the evidence on therapy is really like for most problems. I mean, there are some exceptions like phobias, whatever, that are very specific, but for most therapy that can be addressed, or most problems that can be addressed with therapy, there really is a sense of like common factors, right?
Oh
That
yeah.
it doesn't really kind of matter really what you do with most people,
Yeah.
as long as you're not insane, essentially.
Yeah.
So I think like ethically, it's the same thing I think about with like AI music. I think ethically, the patient should be told that they're dealing with an AI, it shouldn't be a secret, but some people might be fine with an AI, and some people might not be fine with an AI, and that's probably the only thing that matters. As long as you're okay talking with an AI, about your problems, there's no reason why. I mean, I guess some people find this controversial for me to say. There's no reason why an AI therapist can't work. Again, as long as it's not insane, which there are plenty of insane human therapists. So,
Oh, yeah.
um, but generally, I think as long as a person is comfortable, and some people might even be more comfortable talking to a non-sentient AI than a human being about their problems, there's no
Yeah.
reason why an AI wouldn't be a good therapist, essentially. So,
Well,
yeah.
I'm as someone who's hardcore team common factors, and like I
Yeah.
said, Scott Biller is my mentor. Like I found a study out of Sweden, which I think like the ethics of how they got this approved is amazing. Not a huge study, but it was for, young adults and social anxiety, and they, you know, randomized them into two groups and gave, you know, half the people the placebo pill and they told them. And then they gave the other half the antidepressant that was supposed to work. But they gave everybody the antidepressant. There was no placebo, but
Okay, interesting.
they told them they were in the placebo group.
Yeah, okay.
And the group that was told they were taking the antidepressant got better, and those who were in the placebo group but still taking the exact same chemical intervention
All
did
right.
not. And
Uh,
so, what matters so much more than what therapy, and this gets into my view of therapy in general, that it is just the client's view of what's working. It is just that simple.
right,
And
right.
so
Yeah,
that's why we all know it's the relationship, but you have to
yeah,
master eye movements or CBT or DBT or
right,
any of these things we've created. When if the client engages with it, that's usually the good sign, which is the
right,
ironic thing of banning social media or banning phones for 100% of kids. When would this idea ever work?
right.
In theory, it makes no sense.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's where I think like people really just don't, care, whether it's really not about it working in some respects.
Yeah.
It's about the audience, the general public or maybe the older members of the general public or whatever it is. They just want to feel good about themselves, right? And I think there's always this kind of like language of like we're protecting the kids, right?
Yeah.
But I think a lot of it is actually trying to turn the screws on the kids, right? We don't want them to have fun. So the target's always fun somehow. They have to stop having fun with this thing that we didn't get to have fun with when we were their age. And I think that's why people don't care about the data. They just don't like this thing. They want people to live in this like 70s and 80s childhood that never actually existed, sort of a, element. It's just a nostalgia bias. But you see this, I mean, like empirically, this is not like my opinion. I mean, you can see this in study after study that like if you look at like who's most approving of like the censorship of video games or social media, it tends to be adults who don't like kids themselves. So there's very clear correlation between hostile attitudes towards youth and hostile attitudes towards new technology, video games, social media, cell phones, whatever it may be. So even though it's couched in the language of protecting kids, underneath that there tends to be this sort of simmering resentment towards kids. At least correlation. I can't say causal, right? But there's sort of like this correlation. You know, the people who are most likely to endorse these negative attitudes toward technology seem to also have these very negative attitudes towards kids.
That's interesting because that's one of the ideas of the whole book, Kids These Days, is a joke on that very sentiment of, we wrote a whole freaking book about it.
Yeah,
That, if there's something about this rising rate increase in these passive interventions, like that kid's annoying in my classroom, I better refer them out for. And this was interesting, and I want to talk about this, like when you re-looked at the school district data and you found that mental health referrals increased, school
yeah,
suspensions increased all during the first year of a phone-free school. Is
Right.
that right?
That's correct. Yeah. So this was Orange County schools in Florida, which are one of the schools that sort of led the nation, if you will, which sounds like something to be proud of. I'm not sure it is, but with these like cell phone bans. So in 2023, the state of Florida, enacted the statewide cell phone ban, but they gave the schools a little bit of leeway about how strict to be. And so Orange County decided to be as strict as possible. Essentially, no schools or no phones should appear anywhere in the schools. And so not even just classrooms, but no lunch, no recess, no between the classes, no bathroom breaks, nothing. Sort of thing. So like it's kind of like bell to bell ban that you'll hear about quite a bit.
Hmm.
Which, by the way, is profitable because there are companies that have evolved to sell like pouches to keep or safes
Yeah.
to keep the cell. So there's capitalism will ride right on
Yeah.
in these moral panics. But anyway, so yeah, a year after the ban was enforced, obviously suspensions got a lot higher. So they were using suspensions a lot. And then, yeah, mental health referrals increased, bullying increased. The grades really didn't change much one way, or another. And trying to think if there's anything else that was in there. But yeah, basically, all the outcomes were quite negative. And granted, this is only one school district. It's so we can't say too
Yeah.
much causal, or whatever. But you can look at the entire state of Florida, right? So this is just kind of like pre-post design, to be fair. So again, we have to be careful with causal statements. But it's been 2 years since the state of Florida has enacted this, like statewide, some version of a cell phone ban in schools thing. They've now gotten more strict, so now basically the whole state has to be a bell-to-bell ban, if I remember correctly. But the standardized test scores in the state of Florida went down, during the period of this statewide ban. In fact, they're the worst they've been in 20 years at this point. So again, I can't say that wouldn't have happened if only the kids had their phones. I'm not making a causal statement here. What I am saying is that the way this was advertised is that this is going to be great. The kids are going to be paying attention, and you would see these narratives from teachers, right? In the fall of 2023, teachers like these kids are doing great. They're paying attention. They're connected. They're live. They're talking to each other. They're engaged with the material, and then their standardized test scores fell.
Right.
you know,
Exactly.
mental health referrals went up,
Yeah.
bullying increased, all that kind of stuff. So what I can say are two things. One, it obviously didn't fix the problem. I can't say that it made it worse. It might have made it worse. It definitely didn't make it better. But it definitely didn't fix it. And two, these comments by teachers and administrators who are talking about like this utopia that's supposedly evolved in schools just isn't real. I
Hmm.
mean, maybe they're seeing it because we know people can delude themselves, right? This confirmation bias, but it just isn't real. I mean, this utopia that people were portraying in news media about how wonderful the kids were doing wasn't true. It just
Hmm.
absolutely wasn't true. From the school's own data, it was
Yeah.
just not true. So it's kind of fascinating.
It's kind of one of those feels right, but is it right
Yeah,
sort of thing that we keep seeing. You've brought up causation and correlation, and I wanted
yeah,
to chat about this because I listened to a debate with Jonathan Haidt and Candace Odgers,
yeah,
and Candace said, you know, you know, Jonathan, I'm going to buy like 100 copies of your book and give it to my first year university students about how to not make the original sin as a researcher of claiming causation
yeah,
and correlation. So can you just riff for a minute about like how even that subtitle of the book about this has caused an epidemic of
yeah.
mental illness, how we really don't have the data to support this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would say we don't even really have clear correlational data, let alone causal. I mean, if you look at like, studies that track kids over time, longitudinal studies that look at like social media use or smartphone use at time one, and then mental health problems at time two, that we just don't see anything. I mean, different studies find different results, but if you like combine them together in meta-analysis, then the effect size is basically no different from zero. So we don't even see the correlation. Now, what had happened, and why this got attention is again, like in the 2010s, there was this, increase in teen suicide in the United States. It's important to point out, like, this didn't happen in Australia. This didn't happen in
Mhm.
other countries. But who gives a shit? No, no offense, right? Who gives a shit what happens in Australia, right? No, I don't
Yes.
really mean that. I don't really mean
No,
that,
I
by the
know
way.
exactly what you mean.
Yeah, yeah. Be clear, I'm not actually advocating a position, but
Yeah.
everybody looks at the United States and assumes that whatever is going on in the United States must be happening everywhere else, even though it wasn't happening in Australia, New Zealand, the UK, France, Germany. Most other countries this wasn't happening. But nobody, who cares about those? If it's happening in the US, it's happening all over the world as far as people are concerned. So in the United States, we were seeing this rise in the 2010s in teen suicide. Now we also were seeing a rise, as I pointed out, in middle-aged adult suicide too. But no, again, ignore
Yeah.
that. No
Yeah.
way those could be related.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, we won't worry about that.
Yeah.
So it's inconvenient for the narrative. And there was this argument that this was at the same point where like smartphones were getting into more widespread use, that social media was becoming more popular, or maybe there even was this lag. People would argue that there was this lag between like 2009 or so, which is kind of like when I don't know the history. The iPhone apparently started being able to carry social media, and then 5 years later, by some, why 5 years? Like why, obviously there's a certain amount of flexibility in these theories, right? If it had been the same year, it would have been fine. If it had been 10 years, it would have been fine.
Yeah.
This is post hoc reasoning, obviously. But anyway, this argument, like 5 years later, we start to see this like increase in teen suicide, and people just like, kind of drew that together as a correlation, right? So that's the correlation Candace Hodges, I think, is referring to, is this sense of there was this change in society, and then there was this change in this one data point. Now why aren't, again, it's like I said at the beginning, why aren't people ascribing all the positive changes in youth behavior to the same thing? Because again, that's inconvenient for the narrative. That citation, or this is a confirmation bias. We're going to ignore all those other data points, but we focus in on the one negative thing, which is negativity bias too. Right? I talk about all these different
Mhm.
biases, and we draw that connection between this is like the social media smartphone age, and kids got worse on this one thing. And that's the correlation she's speaking to. But there really are like, you can say, well, a correlation could indicate a causal effect, possibly. But there also are two other options. One is that there's a third thing that's causing both, right? So a classic example is when you take a standardized test as a teenager. So in the U.S., it's the SATs. I don't know what you.
Mhm.
I'm sure you have equivalent in Australia.
Yeah. Yeah.
All the high school students take this test, and it's trying to predict their first year GPA in university, right, in college. But the SAT scores don't cause the person's GPA, right? They're correlated with each other, but SATs don't cause their GPA. It's their intelligence, right, which is the thing that causes both. That's the third thing. The third situation, is that it's just random chance. There are two things that correlate in the real world that have no relationship to each other whatsoever. It's what we call an ecological fallacy, right? That sometimes just two things happen to co-occur for a while, just by random chance. And the classic example, of course, is the correlation between the number of Nicolas Cage movies that are released every year and the number of Americans who die in swimming pools
Yeah.
and every year. And it's actually a very strong correlation. I think it's something like, for the people in your audience who know stats, something like a 0.67, I think it is, something like that correlation
Yeah.
coefficient. Pretty strong, much stronger than we ever see in most of social science. And but nobody really thinks that Nicolas Cage movies cause swimming pool deaths. I mean, I've seen a number of Nicolas Cage movies, and maybe I prefer to drown than see another one. But we don't really think that there's a causal effect there, right?
No.
It's an ecological fallacy. So we have to be careful with that kind of data. Same thing happened with television violence. Everybody thought TV violence was causing crime because like TVs were introduced, and then like 20 years later, the U.S. again, nobody gives a shit about Australia, sorry, but
Yeah.
in the U.S. we had this like violent crime wave that began in the late 1960s, really, and people made that kind of connection, like TV violent crime, TV violent crime. Now what happens with these things, right, is eventually like TV keeps going up. When now we have Game of Thrones, right, and all those other like
Yeah.
ultra violent stuff. And maybe your Australian audience doesn't know this, but like violent crime in the U.S. is actually at record lows right now.
Yeah.
Actually, a lot of Americans don't know this. Apparently, for
Well,
whatever reason, that's a hard
yeah.
message. Yeah, go
Even
ahead.
even when we talk about the toxins, like
Yeah,
Rudy Giuliani comes in to be tough on crime in New York, and crime goes down, and all the toxins researchers they were going, well, it's the 20-year latency period of lead. Like,
yeah,
yeah,
sure.
crime just went down. You know,
Yeah.
like so.
As a politician, you want to grab onto those moments, right? When
Yeah.
you didn't do anything, but you get to take credit.
Yeah, exactly. But that's like where I think a lot of people thinking, and I've said this on when I'm interviewed on American podcasts, and I am
Yeah.
an American, so I understand our America central,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah.
But I always say like 2010, you could correlate to the rise of 24-hour news. Like,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
we're sitting there, we're all divided. You can't go talk to your neighbor anymore. You're racist. You're not racist. I said, everything sucks on the news. And
Yeah.
we could write The Anxious Generation about watching the news, you know?
Absolutely.
Why we're all
Yeah.
fighting about politics all the time, you know? Like,
Yeah.
um, it's amazing. I think it's one of the ones we talked about in the book was heavy metal music in the happiest
Yeah.
countries. You
Hmm.
know, like does
Yeah, all those
happiness come?
Scandinavian
Yeah,
countries. Yeah, like Finland. Yeah, I've never been to Finland. I know I have a few friends who are Finnish, so I have nothing but admiration for them.
yeah,
It's funny, right? Because like you always hear about them. They're the number one most educated country. I think,
yeah,
that's my understanding, at least, and there's only like 35 of them. They've got that advantage going for them
yeah,
anyway, right?
yeah,
And yeah, I don't know if you talk to a Finn, I don't know that they would agree that they're happy. The way I've heard it described is that their expectations from life are so low that they inevitably exceed them, kind
yeah.
of a thing. So,
They're very
you
stoic.
very stoic. They do seem
Yeah,
very stoic, yeah. But and then I sometimes joke with my even with my students, say like, Finland is like the number one educated country on the planet. I think like literally all education is free, including university.
mm,
In fact, even as like Americans, you can go to Finland and get free college education. Like it's open to everybody, like literally everybody. The only disadvantage being then you have to live in Finland,
live
for
breathing.
4 years, which I'm sure is a lovely country, just freezing cold,
Yeah,
But then I say like, but think about it for a minute, like what do they make? Like what shortage in the world do we have if Finland ceases to exist? And the only answer is like symphonic metal, right? You know what I mean? Like, like I will be sad because, Nightwish will no longer exist. You know what I mean?
right.
And that's like Finland's best export is like good sounding, like girly goth metal.
Yeah, heavy metal. There you go. That's why there's yeah, exactly. Oh, it's so funny. I wanted to just before we wrap up ask you about the loneliness study that you just
Yeah.
recently kind of picked apart a little bit. Can you say a bit about that?
Yeah, so occasionally I moonlight as a journalist.
Yeah.
I guess I don't know. That's probably not fair for me to make that claim, but yeah, no. So I write a column every so often for Real Clear Investigations, and I think that the beat. I'm trying to like absorb all this journalistic
All the
lingo and actually be
journalism
one.
speak. Yeah.
Yeah. The beat that I'm tends to be this kind of like bullshit beat or whatever.
Yeah.
But I went into this one a pretty open mind. I mean, so it was myself and the editor, one of the editors over there, were kind of riffing on like, oh, what should we do now? It would say, well, there's a Surgeon General, in the U.S. Always the U.S. The
Yeah. Yeah,
Surgeon
that's
General in
okay.
the U.S. has released a statement about this like loneliness epidemic. Now, this was in 2023. That the statement was released. We were just obviously talking about it more recently. What do you think about? Yeah, I think like, what do you think about that? Like, I mean, it sounds dramatic. I mean, but
Mm.
I don't know. I mean, maybe. Yeah, obviously the world has changed. It was possible. So I was kind of curious, and I mean, I went in with an open mind, and interviewed a number of scholars who, because I don't do anything on loneliness, so it's not my area on like the
Yeah.
cell phones or social media, whatever. So I interviewed a bunch of different scholars, including some scholars who had been cited by the Supreme Court. Sorry, it's a Surgeon General. I don't want to keep saying Supreme Court today. My God, my
Yeah.
Alzheimer's is flaring up. I do apologize. I'm getting older, and so I'm misspeaking a bunch. But no, the Surgeon General. I reached out to the Surgeon General himself, or the former Surgeon General. He didn't reply. The
Yeah.
Surgeon General's office said that they were basically too busy because of the government shutdown in the U.S.
Mhm.
And everybody was fired. I don't know.
Yeah.
So I didn't get to speak to anybody over there. I did also try to reach out to the. So it turns out the Surgeon General doesn't actually write the report. They hire somebody to write the report. In this case, it turned out to be a scholar who does loneliness stuff. And this is I always want to do one of these things. She's not the first one to do this. Like where I want to get hired by like a big agency like the Surgeon General to review my own research and declare it beyond any further, scrutiny, whatever, which is kind of what she did in a way.
Yeah.
I'm not saying she's a bad person. I'm sure she's lovely, whatever. But I'd love to be able to do this. But anyway, she didn't really reply to us either. She just sent us to her frequently asked questions page. But anyway, most of the scholars were like, no, my research doesn't say there's a loneliness epidemic. What happened is apparently what the data actually suggests that at least in the United States and probably other
Yeah.
highly developed countries like Australia, that there's been a very modest change in the amount of time we spend with other people.
Yeah.
So we seem to spend about 1.7% less time with other people than we did 20 years ago. Again, 1.7% less. That's
Yeah.
not a lot, but it's there. I mean, apparently that's pretty robust. There's been this
Mhm.
1.7% decline. So it's time spent with others. That's where there is this evidence for a decline, or time spent alone. That's not the same thing as loneliness. That's really kind of like
No.
what everybody kept telling me, is like that's not the same thing. Sometimes people suck, it turns out, right?
Yeah.
Not being with them might actually be a benefit. So people would like legitimately point to, like, obviously marriage rates have gone down, church attendance has gone down. I don't know that I care about the church, but maybe the marriage stuff is a legitimate concern, or whatever, because I do kind of have this, maybe this is my irrational moral panic, but I do kind of believe that kids do better in like a committed. It doesn't have to be like literally a legal marriage, but kids do better with two parents. I don't care if they're gay or straight or whatever, but
Yeah.
I think two parents are better than one. It's pretty non-controversial to say. But anyway, yeah. So I mean, basically, what the Surgeon General had said, which I guess is the lesson. We always have to be careful, right? Which was just not supported, by the evidence, and even really wasn't supported by the scholars that they, well, or at least most of the scholars that they had cited in the report. I don't think we found one person who at least that we reached out to, in the that were cited in the report themselves,
Yeah.
that agreed with this, that their data supported that there was a loneliness epidemic,
Yeah.
so yeah, I mean, apparently there isn't a loneliness epidemic, it turns out, which I
Yeah.
guess is good news. But well, I mean, it is good news, but the bad news, of course, is, this again, I think there is something to this idea that we keep having these like mini crises or whatever, and maybe it's going back to your comment about news media, right? Is like, I don't know, maybe we should be like a little bit worried about like marriage rates or church attendance, like maybe are spending less time with other people, and maybe that's like a 2 out of 10 level problem, but for some reason, like everything has to be an 11. You know what I mean? Like we
Yeah.
can't just say like, hey, maybe we should think a little bit about like spending more time with friends. No, it's a crisis. This is
Yeah.
like the world is falling apart, and I'm actually starting to really recognize how many problems are out there that in some cases may be legitimate problems, in other cases may not even be legitimate problems, but we're always on 11. So it's crisis, 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 and to your point about news media, I mean, obviously they drive this, right? As do politicians and
Oh, yeah.
whatever. I'm sure that cell phones in schools are another example of this, that maybe we don't want the kids in class, at least, with their phones out. Although I don't think that's the problem. The problem is that the teachers are dull, is the problem. You know.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, this was my argument in the book, because as a therapist, if I sit with a teenager and they leave my office after one session and go, that guy's an idiot, what
Yeah.
frickin' difference does it make if I have doctorate or MSW or
Yeah.
I'm solution focused or cognitive behavioral? Makes no
Yeah.
difference. So it's kind of like a comedian being on stage and no one's laughing, and it's
Right.
like, well, you might not be funny.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
if the kids are bored, what's the point of the teacher?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I think there is this like I referenced before, it's like nostalgia bias. Everybody, because it's the other thing I hear. People say like kids should live like we did in the 70s and 80s, right?
I know.
Where all the kids would get together on the playground and we would just pick up and play a pickup game of some sort of like, I don't know, softball or whatever, kickball, whatever, and everybody got along, and it was always 72 degrees, and the sun was always out, but somehow
Yeah.
there was always enough rain, so all the trees were,
Vibrant.
everything was perfect. The hummingbirds would come, and the Mr. Bluebird was on everybody's shoulder, and everything was perfect. And like that never existed. That was not the reality. Because keep in mind, like that was the worst generation on record. Like those kids, which this is me. I was this generation. I remember this. they were the worst kids on most violent crime, most suicides, most teen pregnancy. Everything I talked about before that's going well with Gen Z was horrible for Gen X,
Mm.
you know. So there was never this utopia. But yeah, in our day, I mean, I remember I was never a good student, right? You know, until I got to university, and I
Yeah,
don't know, I
same.
like
Yeah.
university, but you know, we just would sleep. You know, or doodle, or daydream, or talk, or even roughhouse with our friends, you know, and stuff. Or we would just skip class. You know, I
Oh,
mean, so it's not like, you know, we all were sitting around paying attention to the teacher, you know, back in the 1980s. You know, it's just we didn't have cell phones, so we had to find something else to do, you know, with ourselves, you know. So that I think the cell phone is just the symptom. You know, it's just like now they can look at their cell phones and amuse themselves, which, you know, good for them. That's exactly the same thing I do in a
oh,
faculty meeting, you know.
totally. Yeah, I would have loved that. Just sitting in a
Precisely.
chemistry class wanting to die. Yeah. I
The
think
problem
there's,
with me and with the cell phone in the faculty meeting is the exact same problem as with the student in the school. The problem is not the cell phone. The problem is that the person yakking is either dull or full of shit.
yeah,
You know, and I know it.
totally.
This is worth more of my time than this person is. You
Yeah.
know, and the problem is with this person, not with this machine. You know,
Yeah.
and that's the reality, and that's why these cell phone bans are not actually fixing anything in
Yeah.
schools.
I think that's right. And I think every time I hear someone calling for it, it sounds like they're simultaneously calling for Leave It to Beaver. And it's like, and I just always think I grew up in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., in a nice enough neighborhood on a cul-de-sac with a playground and park at the end of it. Like we
Yeah,
could go anywhere. There was no cars. We were outside all the time. And my dad used to say, you should stay outside more. I'm like,
yeah,
I can't be outside anymore. Like I'm
mhm,
outside all the time. And so I
yeah,
still think it is this adult bias that
yeah,
there's something just wrong with the kids these days and they need what I had. And I message this to someone when they talk about music. Like the best
yeah.
music is always the music you had as a teenager,
Sure,
you know?
absolutely. Yeah.
So we
Mhm.
all think, we're going to think, remember that time we tried to ban phones? We should, go for that again in
Yeah,
20
yeah,
years. Yeah.
yeah.
Chris, thank you so much for chatting. That was really fun. I enjoyed
Yeah,
laughing, and thanks for giving me your evening. Um, but
absolutely.
but I
Yeah.
really appreciate your work and sense of humor you bring with it all, because a lot of it is just batshit crazy.
That's all you can do is laugh sometimes, right? I've accepted the minimal impact I have on the world, so sometimes all you can do is just have a sense of humor about it and
Yeah.
try to giggle along with the lunacy, I guess.
Well, I
So,
think at least we have jobs where we get to write whatever we want, and
yeah, this is true.
and
Oh
and
yeah,
they
I mean, yeah, I mean, we're not coal miners, right? You know, it's like
no. No, I say to people, I don't know what these academic. I really appreciated your post about, getting a promotion to chair, because Nevin took over as chair
like a
of
duck
his.
getting a promotion to L'Orange.
Yeah, well, Nevin took over as chair of his department in
Poor
Canada,
guy.
and he's like, "Will, this is the worst fucking job."
Yeah.
I'm like, I know, and so it
Only on
is.
television do faculty members fight over who's going to be department chair. If
Yeah,
anything, in real life, it's the opposite. It's like in the military, everybody takes a step back.
yeah,
The sucker who is slow,
yeah,
uh, you
it's
know.
awful.
All
Anyway,
right.
thank you so much,
Yeah.
man. I really appreciated meeting you and chatting with you.
Absolutely. Real pleasure here as well. You have a good
Thanks.
day.